The SNP's had a tough time in the last couple of years. The fact that I'm here as leader of the SNP rather indicates that we've had a tough time. We've got to make progress on the two-state solution and ensuring that the Palestinian state is recognised. We've had 14 years of austerity, we've had Brexit, we've got the cost of living crisis. Every one of these, austerity, Brexit, cost of living, are all a product of Westminster decision making.
65% of people think Matheson should resign. Why are you expending so much political capital on this issue?
It's an issue of fairness and natural justice.
First Minister, welcome to PoliticsJOE.
Thank you, lovely to be with you.
I'd like to congratulate you first of all, your choice of venue. We're not near a skip fire or anything. How's your campaign been going so far, would you say?
The campaign's gone well. We've got off to a good start. Obviously, it all happened in a bit of a hurry. You know, I don't think anybody or many people expected the Prime Minister to call an election last Wednesday, but he did. And we've got out the blocks quickly with a campaign launch on Thursday, and I've been touring around different parts of the country, and it's been great to be out and about meeting members of the public and getting my party supporters geared up and ready for the election. It's been great.
You've written to Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer calling for the UK to recognise Palestine as a state in its own right, and you say it will go some way to bring the peace process along. Why do you say that?
We've got an absolute humanitarian catastrophe on our hands in Gaza, and the suffering that has been endured is just completely and utterly indefensible. So it is vital that we get to an immediate ceasefire and that we have the return of the hostages and that we stop arms sales to Israel, because this conflict must be brought to a halt. But if we're to secure lasting peace in the area, we've got to make progress on the two-state solution and ensuring that the Palestinian state is recognised. So I want the United Kingdom to join with other European countries, Spain, the Republic of Ireland, and recognise the Palestinian state, and to do that right away.
We've seen the dreadful scenes in Rafah this weekend and overnight and today. Do you accept Benjamin Netanyahu's description of this as a tragic mishap?
No, I don't. I think it has gone completely and utterly beyond anything that can be defended or explained. It went past that a long time ago. The SNP has been calling for an immediate ceasefire for some considerable number of months, and it is going on and on and on. Now, the original attack by Hamas was completely and utterly unacceptable. It was reprehensible. It was the most awful act of terrorism, and it should never have happened. And the hostages that have been detained must be returned, and they should have been returned much earlier than even now. So I'm absolutely crystal clear in my condemnation of Hamas and their conduct. But the prolonged suffering of the people of Gaza has just gone on for far too long, and we need to bring that to a halt. We need to bring it to a halt with an immediate ceasefire. We need to stop the arms sales to Israel, and we need to recognise the Palestinian state.
If you don't accept Netanyahu's assessment of this as a tragic mishap, would you describe this as a targeted attack on civilians?
What's happened, I think, can only be described as a targeted attack on civilians. I think there's a judgment here about the potential impact of an attack on refugee settlement, and I think we all can work out what that's likely to be. So I think in those circumstances, this attack is beyond defence, and for that reason I think we have to, for that reason alone, but for many other reasons with which this question has been wrestled for some time, there has to be an immediate ceasefire.
You mentioned an immediate ceasefire. More than 70% of Brits think there should be an immediate ceasefire, and that polling was done before this latest offensive. Why do you think the Conservatives and the Labour Party are so unwilling to take up this mantle when there's such a mandate for it?
I don't know the answer to that question, because I look at the degree of suffering and I can't in any part of my conscience contemplate that suffering and to believe it to be defensible. So the case for an immediate ceasefire is absolutely overwhelming, and that case has existed for some considerable time, and we need to secure that at the earliest possible opportunity.
Why do you think the SNP are expected to lose seats in this election?
The SNP's had a tough time in the last couple of years. I'd be the first to admit that. The fact that I'm here as leader of the SNP rather indicates that we've had a tough time. It wasn't.
You're underselling yourself.
It wasn't. Well, it wasn't. It wasn't part of my life plan, to be honest.
No, famously.
I stood down from senior office a year ago, believing that I had, I'd served for 16 years as a senior government minister. I felt as if I had really made a big contribution to the public life of Scotland, and it was time for me to step aside. So it wasn't part of my game plan to become leader of the SNP and the First Minister of Scotland, but my party's faced difficulties, and I think the country faces some challenges, so I've come in to try to address that, to strengthen my party and to make sure we've got a clear and understandable message for the Westminster election. And I'll take that around the country. I'll take it around the country with a lot of energy to make sure that people hear our message and boost our support. So we've got a way to climb back up, but that's what our campaign is all about. It's about getting out there and climbing back up and sharing our message of hope and optimism with the people of Scotland, and recognising that Westminster has inflicted significant damage on Scotland. We've had 14 years of austerity, we've had Brexit, we've got the cost of living crisis. Every one of these, austerity, Brexit, cost of living, are all a product of Westminster decision making, and for the people of Scotland, the answer to that is to take decisions into our own hands, to make sure that we can to take the decisions that are important in people's lives, that are made in Scotland for Scotland, because history tells us when we take our own decisions here in Scotland, they're good decisions for the people of our country. You
say that the answer is to take decision making into Scotland's own hands, but polling puts, some polls put Labour 10% ahead in the polls. It suggested that you could lose, Labour could win up to 25 seats in Scotland. Could you pinpoint that on anything? What do you think people will find compelling about the Labour Party, about this Labour Party compared to previously? I don't think I'm the best person to ask that question to, because I find the Labour Party constantly disappointing. And I think when I look at what's being offered to people in Scotland, let's take our public service. Our public services are under enormous pressure in terms of the delivery of what people need. Our health service, particularly post-COVID, we need to have an injection of investment into our health service. Now, we've taken decisions in Scotland to ask people on higher incomes to contribute more in taxation, and we've put that money into the health service. So we've used our powers in the Scottish Parliament to increase the amount of money we've got available to us and to invest that in strengthening our National Health Service. That's the right thing for us to do as a government. But the NHS needs more than that, and it can't get more than that because there isn't the investment going in England. And as I listen to the Labour Party, I don't hear the explanation of more resources going into our public services. So that's one of the reasons why I find the Labour Party disappointing. I think they will just continue the austerity agenda of the Conservative government, and that is not what Scotland needs. So that's why I say that after all these years where we've seen so much damage done to Scotland, austerity, Brexit, the cost of living crisis, all of them a product of Westminster decision making, Scotland needs to take the power into our own hands. You mentioned earlier the SNP has had a difficult recent history, and part of that I would say is the case of your colleague Michael Matheson. I'm going to have to catch up with the PoliticsJOE audience. They're very well versed in UK-wide politics, but not necessarily in Scotland, which was obviously very disappointing. The Scottish Parliament's Standards Committee has recommended that the former Health Secretary, Michael Matheson, be suspended from Parliament for 27 days and his salary docked for 54 days. He racked up an £11,000 data roaming bill and tried to expense it. You say you can't support this recommendation and will challenge it. Why do you say that? The first thing I want to say is that Michael has made mistakes, and Michael's got to address those mistakes and to be held accountable for those mistakes. So I don't have an issue with that. What I have an issue with is the way in which this matter's been handled by the Scottish Parliament, because
one of the members of the Standards Committee that sat in judgment on Michael has made comments beforehand which prejudged the outcome of that hearing. Now that to me runs against the process of natural justice, because in any other walk of life, if I had a constituent came to me and said, I'm going to be sitting on I'm going to have a case heard by a disciplinary panel to do with my work, and one of the people on that panel has prejudged the case and has made public comments about it, and they're going to sit on the panel, I would have pursued that organisation, because that's unjust, it's unfair. But here we have our Parliament prepared to do exactly that. And I think that, and why do I say this is important? Well, there was another member of the committee who had made comments in advance, and he resigned from the committee because he thought he couldn't be unbiased. So I'm not making this problem up. This problem exists. And I just think that's got to be addressed. But I stress, Michael's got to be held to account for the mistakes that he's made.
The MSP whose presence on the committee you object to, she said, Matheson's desperate efforts to justify his outrageous expenses claim have been riddled with lies, cover-ups, and the need for us all to suspend his disbelief. What part of that is not accurate? My
point is the fact that these comments have been made by somebody who's sitting in judgment about somebody else. How's that fair? If this was let's say it was a jury in a trial, that person would be taken off the jury. If this was an employment tribunal, that person would be taken off the employment tribunal. So it's not for me to nitpick about words. It's the fact that somebody's sitting in judgment having prejudged the case, and that offends the very basic principles of natural justice.
You've said repeatedly that Matheson is a friend of yours, and also you've railed against cronyism in the Tories in Westminster, particularly with a view to the Owen Paterson case. How is this any different?
Well, I'm simply being transparent with people. Of course Michael's a friend of mine, but I'm setting out what the problem is. And nobody, absolutely nobody, has said to me that this is the reason why this is okay. Nobody's done that. And I think that's, one other member of Parliament has withdrawn from this committee because they thought they couldn't be unbiased. Well, here we've got a member of the committee who is exercising bias because they've prejudged the case. I don't think that's appropriate.
I think some would argue there's a difference between bias and things being true. I suppose you could say that she's made a valid assessment of Matheson.
Well, but how's it possible for in every other walk of life these standards to be applied and for them not to be applied in our national parliament? That's my point.
I think I suppose the difference is it's a public body and the standard should be held higher.
Matheson
had a higher standard the public like to adhere to, and he's failed at that.
I'm all for the highest standards being applied, and that's why I think it's ridiculous that a member of Parliament is allowed to sit on a disciplinary panel who's prejudged the case. That's not high standards, that's the lowest of standards.
65% of people think Matheson should resign. You mentioned it earlier, you've got an uphill battle in this election. Why are you expending so much political capital on this issue?
Well, it's an issue of fairness and natural justice, and I don't think I'd be much of a political leader or much of a First Minister if I don't confront injustice, and that's what I'm doing. Now, as I've said, Michael's going to have to account for his actions. Of course he will do, and he'll have to be held to account for these. But I don't think I'd be much of a political leader if I just gave in to an argument which I think is fundamentally flawed because of the behaviour of a Member of Parliament I think is inappropriate.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.